Hello and welcome back to the Upgrade Your Education Business podcast. If you're new here, I'm Sumantha McMahon, and this podcast is all about sharing actionable tips that will help you with your business. And today I'm diving into a topic that's becoming a growing trend in our world, and that is podcasting. Now, I'll start by clarifying one thing. I'm not saying that you need a podcast in your business to succeed, but if you've got a captive audience and you're looking for a powerful way to connect with them, and you think you have the kind of audience who will listen to a podcast, it can be a great tool. It's been one of the best things that I created in my business. But also, maybe you're already thinking of one. This isn't about me convincing you. This is just about me giving you a really honest reflection on what it takes and just to give you some tips, some lessons learnt that will help you if it is something that you embark on. So let's dive in. Welcome to the Upgrade Your Education Business podcast. I'm your host, Sumantha, and I'm so pleased you're here. As an education business owner myself and a former teacher, I understand the nuances that only apply to us. So in this podcast, I share fluff-free, tailored and actionable ideas that you can mould to suit your needs. If you'd like to take this conversation further, please do reach out. I would love to meet you. And finally, it would mean the world to me if you could leave a review. That way, you'll be helping me help more people. Thank you for tuning in. Enjoy. Podcasts in the education niche are on the rise, and I'm thrilled about it. I love a good podcast. And even from a perspective where you don't have one, it's a good thing because it's a great visibility tool. If you can be a guest on podcasts, for example, the more voices that we have, the richer this industry becomes, the more relationships we form. So for me, it's a really good thing. I really like it. And I do find that podcasting is really different from other mediums. When you're listening to someone's voice in your ears and you're kind of listening consistently, you connect with them in a really different way. And as a podcaster, I'm able to share information, I'm able to share knowledge and expertise and experiences in a very, very different way than if it was in written form. So if I even wrote a blog that was more detailed than, let's say, a social media post, this just feels different. And I do find that when I have discovery calls with people where they've listened to my podcast, or even if I meet them out and about, we kind of start from a different point in that relationship. It doesn't feel quite so brand new. It's really nice. But podcasts are hard work. So if you're thinking of having one as a business tool, it's really important to be realistic and to put things in place that's going to make it sustainable and also to make it a valuable tool. You want your podcast to work really hard for you. Before I dive into a few different things, a really good place to start is really understanding and being clear on what purpose it will serve in your business. And the reason why this is such an important starting point is because that purpose will steer absolutely everything. It will steer the length of your episodes. It will steer your style, your tone, the way you communicate things, the topics, the guests that you may have on. If you do have a podcast with guests, it will steer absolutely everything. And it's really important because a podcast can only serve as a valuable tool if people listen to it and if you can get loyal listenership. So if people listen to it every week or whatever your frequency is. So I'm going to go through a few things that will really help to support that, to make sure that if you do choose to have a podcast, it does serve as a really valuable and powerful business tool for you. One of the most valuable lessons that I've learned is to stay really consistent with your style. And that's my first tip, especially in the early days where you're establishing yourself and where people are almost forming that habit of listening to you. So it's really easy to almost see a podcast as a bit of a passion project. I have been tempted at times to digress from my style. And now that I'm kind of 140 something episodes in, I probably could a little bit. So you may have noticed recently, I've had some guests who aren't quite in the education space. Maybe they're not educators and maybe they're actually sharing more of their story as opposed to giving us actionable tips. So I'm playing with different styles, sort of, but my solo episodes still stay really consistent because if I change the deal, then people who have formed that habit to listen to this podcast, well, I'll probably lose them, and I don't want to. I value them. When I think of myself as a podcast listener, I actually choose which one to listen to based on my mood, based on the time that I have. So if I'm doing my housework, I might listen to something that's a bit longer, like an interview on the Diary of a CEO podcast, where those interviews tend to be quite lengthy. Or maybe I'll break it up. So I'll listen to half of it, listen to half of it later when I'm doing something that I don't really have to concentrate on. If I want to sit down and learn something, if I'm ready to use my brain a bit more, then I might listen to something that's really actionable, something that will help my business. So I do decide what to listen to based on my mood. Now, if all of a sudden what I was expecting, because based on past patterns, if that's not what was delivered, I'd kind of lose trust. I wouldn't be sure whether to listen to that particular podcast. So you want to develop that trust, and you can do that by staying consistent with your style. So this doesn't mean you can't have a bit of fun with it, doesn't mean you can't experiment. But when you have that fundamental why, the thing that I started this with, where you need to be really clear on what purpose it's serving for your business, then you can experiment, but within certain boundaries, so to speak. I was very clear when I set up this podcast. I was very clear that I wanted each episode to almost serve as a mini training episode, almost like mini training pieces. And the reason was because, well, it was twofold. Firstly, I wanted this podcast to be a funnel into my business. I don't really like having pushy sales calls. In fact, I don't do them. And that's why I pour so much time and energy into things like my podcast, into things like my social media posts, into things like lead magnets and webinars, because I want people to arrive at a discovery call with an idea of whether they want to work with me or not, because then we can just have a really good discussion about their situation. I don't have to spend the majority of that selling what I offer. So that's my preference, and that's the purpose it serves. Also, the second reason is because in the early days of setting up my business, I received a lot of help from the community, from people who didn't really know they even helped me. I would read Facebook threads and I would learn from comments. And so I always decided that when I set up Upgrade Your Education business, I would always be doing something to give back, to, pay that forward so that other people are also getting that experience. Maybe you're listening and you never have an inclination to work with me. That's absolutely fine. I create this podcast for you as well, not just potential clients. So because I'm really certain about that fact, I know exactly what kind of things to include. I know what topics to talk about, and I know what style my podcast episodes need to be in. Now, my second tip, and by the way, these are in no particular order. My second tip is to invest in really good quality audio. Now, this might be controversial because many people will tell you to just, start with Zoom and your mobile phone, for example. And you can start like that. You don't need to invest in a big setup. Now, while I agree that you shouldn't let fancy equipment hold you back or a budget hold you back, I also firmly believe that audio quality matters because that is the medium of a podcast. You might be watching this on YouTube, but the majority of you listen to this. And so if the quality was really crackly, if there was loads of background noise, if it just wasn't a pleasant experience, you wouldn't want to listen to it. It might give you a headache, might give you a migraine. It's just not pleasant. So I do think that a little bit of effort needs to go into the audio quality. Now, when I started mine, I actually didn't invest in a podcasting microphone straight away. I started using my webcam's microphone. The quality wasn't fantastic. It did sound like I was a little bit at a distance. And what I did was I used software to just improve the quality a little bit. Now, there's only so much software will do. If you don't have a good raw recording, it's hard to make it sound top quality, but you can improve the quality. Now, since then, I invested in a second-hand Blue Yeti microphone. If you know about microphones, it was a compressor mic. And what it meant was that it picked up a lot of background noise. In fact, I was using it up till only about 5 episodes ago. It picks up a lot of background noise. So the software that I use, I've had to use AI just to remove some of that background noise, which then affects the overall quality. Now, now that I've been doing this a while and I know this is a really worthwhile investment in my business, I have invested a good amount of money into the microphone I'm using now. This gives me a really crisp, raw recording, which means that I don't have to do quite so much editing, which means I'm not compromising the quality of my audio. Now, when I did invest in a microphone, when I stopped using my webcam, it really made a difference, not only to the quality of the audio, but to my confidence. I just felt a bit more professional. I felt a little less hesitant about putting my content out there, worried that maybe the quality isn't good enough for people. So knowing that I was creating a better listening experience made me feel more professional, and it just alleviated one less stress, one less headache, which I think then fed back into the quality of my episodes. I was able to relax a little bit more. My third tip is to think about simplifying your editing process. Editing can actually be the most time consuming part of having a podcast, and it's often what stops people from being consistent. Now, when I talk about editing, I'm talking about removing mistakes. I always make mistakes with my recordings, even when I've scripted an episode. I always make mistakes. For me, with my previous microphone, editing also involved getting rid of background noise. It meant just improving the audio quality a little bit. So, editing can mean different things to different people, but it can be time consuming. So, if you have the budget to, you can delegate it, you can outsource it. Your editor doesn't have to be a podcasting expert. My VA actually handles my editing now that I have found a very friendly piece of software that helps do that easily. So my VA isn't particularly technical, but she's able to do a good job with editing it with my instructions and with this piece of software. So I'm spending money on my VA and this piece of software. Or there are podcast editors, there are agencies who will take care of everything for you. So it kind of depends on your budget and how much you want to spend on your podcast. Now, I will just quickly say that anything that I recommend, I'm going to put the links to them in the show notes. So if you've got questions like, okay, what is that piece of software? Instead of giving you loads of names for you to remember while you're listening to this, you're probably on the go while you're listening. I will put all the links in the show notes. So just save this episode if you need to refer to it, and then you can check the show notes later. So if outsourcing isn't really an option for you, you can use tools that makes it a lot faster. I use Descript, and also I use Riverside, and I'll talk about why I use both very shortly. But using these kinds of platforms has been an absolute game changer because both of them have an element of AI. So there are AI tools you can use that improve things. Now, for anyone who's podcasting, anyone who has looked into this might be wondering, why are you using two different platforms? Why are you paying for two different platforms? Well, my reason is because I have a video podcast, because this goes out on YouTube as well. And I really wanted to invest in improving the quality of my video as well. And that's where Riverside kicks in. Unfortunately, I'm yet to find one platform that does everything. So Riverside gives me the better quality video, whereas Descript is much easier when it comes to editing. The AI tools are a bit more powerful, and also, Descript is a more stable recording platform. I used to use Zoom. I used Zoom for a very long time because I already pay for that for my teaching and all my work. But it does compress the audio and it does compress the video. So that's why over time, I've just changed the platforms that I've used. As time has gone on, I've invested more money into the podcast and so on. So you don't have to have a really, really big setup. But if you can have something that allows you to create an episode that needs minimal editing, that will really help. And then if you invest in a tool where editing is really, really easy, where you don't need technical knowledge about audio and video and all the rest of it, then again, the editing becomes streamlined. And that will basically help you sustain this. Running a podcast is hard. It is hard work because of all these different moving parts. So if you can streamline that, make it easier, you're way more likely to be able to put episodes out a little bit more often. And actually on that, I'm going to slip in another little tip. The frequency matters and committing to it matters. Podcasts are a long game. They're not this kind of one-off audio episode that everyone's going to listen to. It's not like a webinar as such. A podcast is something that people build in often to their listening routine. So if you've got a podcast that you really want to serve your business, then you need to be consistent. And ideally, it will be every week. Every 2 weeks or longer gaps means people don't really know when to expect it. They lose track of, hang on, is this the week that it's going to be published? Is this the week it isn't? Yes, you can announce things, but then you're relying on things like social media or whatever you use. But the consistency means you don't have to rely on anything. You've got people into the habit, they know when to expect your episodes, and you stick to it. So for all this time, all the years that I've been running this, my episodes go out every week. They go out my main episode goes out on a Monday at 6 a.m. UK time. And then when I added my Wednesday short soundbite, that happens every Wednesday. And I do that every week. Every 10 weeks, I take a 1 week break. Now, people may not be aware of that. Yes, I am reliant on people knowing that or seeing it on social media. But that consistency means that people are loyal. And I know they are because I pay attention to data. And that is my next tip. Do look at data. Your podcast data is gold. Over time, you'll notice patterns. So you'll see what kind of topics resonate with your audience. Now, I know, for example, there are certain topics that will get me loads and loads of listens, but I still rotate around other topics. I don't just stick to them. So this episode probably won't get my highest number of listens. It's not a topic that I have seen is massively in demand. But I'm still going to talk about it because I know it's interesting and I know it's relevant. And, my aim is to help people. So even if this resonates with 5 people, if they're like, oh, I was waiting for a podcast episode about this, that's great. But it also means that from a strategic point of view, I will always be blending those other topics in. So every single season, I will have certain topics that will come up because I can see from past data that my audience loves them. Now, this feeds into which hosting platform you're going to choose. A hosting platform is basically somewhere where you upload your recording and it distributes it out to all the different podcast players. So I don't individually upload this to Apple, to Google, to all these different listening platforms, to Spotify. I upload it once and my hosting application just distributes them out. I have to connect it. There's a little bit of a setup there, but it's a one-time thing. Now, you can go for a free one, like Anchor, for example. You can go for a cheaper one, like Buzzsprout. In fact, I started, and for a few years, I was on Buzzsprout. But with Anchor, you don't get very rich data. With the Buzzsprout, the data is a bit inflated because they're not showing you unique listens. So let's say I listened to my own podcast 20 times, it will count those. At least that's what I found. Whereas now I've switched to Captivate, my listener number is lower than it used to be on Buzzsprout, but it's a true reflection. It counts unique listens. And that's really important because data is important not only to make decisions, but at some point you may want sponsorship, for example. And if you're going to go for sponsorship, then people need to know this data. Otherwise, how do they make a decision whether they should invest their money into your podcast? So paying attention to data and choosing the kind of platform that gives you a good reflection of how your podcast is doing is important, because that's the only data you have to go by. This isn't a social media post where I can actually see who's pressing like, where people are commenting. That's not the nature of this. All I see is raw data. I see numbers. I don't see people. I don't get to. So that's really important that you are getting that information, particularly if you want to use this podcast as a tool for your business. That data is going to matter. Don't go into it blind. Now, it doesn't mean you have to spend a fortune on a hosting platform, but choose one that's going to give you the kind of data that allows you to make really good decisions. My 5th tip leans into what I talked about earlier, where being consistent is actually really important for a successful podcast. And a tip I have is to batch create some of your episodes. Now, batch creating is something that has really, really changed my experience of podcasting. I intended to do it at the beginning. I did plan to do it, but I had underestimated how long each episode was taking me. And it's because I was learning, and I'm still learning. But at the time, each episode took me a while to record, to edit, all of it, to prepare. And so batch creating was really, really hard. So every week I was under that pressure to record. I need to get this podcast episode out. Over time, I was able to delegate. As I've mentioned, I've invested in software that makes a lot of the editing easier. I've invested in a better microphone, which means that there's less editing to do. So all of these different things have actually released time. And now I am able to batch. And it just eases that pressure. Now, when I'm batching, similar to all of my content, and if you're in the Tutors Mastermind, I've taught you this with the 1-year content plan training. You can still batch while staying really relevant. So even though I'm recording this podcast episode a few weeks before it's due to be launched, before you're listening to this, I know exactly what date it's going to go out. I've already planned that beforehand. And I know what's happening at that time. So let's say I was running a webinar next week. I would know to talk about that today. So I know what's going on. I can still keep it relevant and I can batch create. And when you're batch creating, something that's really useful to think about, even if you don't batch create, is how you can create some evergreen podcast episodes, as in topics that will be relevant no matter when someone listens to it. Now, sometimes it won't be evergreen as such. So earlier this year, I released one that was kind of 8 reflections from 8 years out of the classroom. Well, that 8 years is going to turn into 9 next year and 10 the year after and so on. So the title may not be kind of totally accurate if you're listening to this in 2 years' time, but the lessons are, the things that I'm sharing in there are. So try and think about how you can keep your podcast topics quite evergreen, because the thing about podcasting is just because you're releasing it on a day doesn't mean that's when everyone who's ever going to listen is going to listen on that day. You will have people who discover your podcast a few years later, not just months, not just weeks, but years later. So you still want your content to be relevant. And that's a really key way to make your podcast work really hard for you, for it to be a really powerful business tool. You can even do a limited time podcast. It doesn't have to be something that's just ongoing. And once your episodes are out there, they're out there. As long as you're still paying for that hosting platform, those podcast episodes stay there and people can listen to them whenever they want. You don't have to keep creating fresh content. So batch creating can really help sustain all of that. It can help make everything a lot easier. And really, ultimately, it helps you stay consistent. Some final thoughts. Starting a podcast can feel a bit overwhelming, but it's also a really exciting way to connect with your audience, to share your expertise, to help people get to know you, to hear your voice. The thing that I found when I was first thinking of having my podcast, I remember thinking, will anyone even listen? But then my focus shifted, and this was the thing that did it for me. My focus shifted where I thought, actually, I have things I want to say. Even if 2 people listen, that's fine. There are things I want to say. And so I'm using this as a platform to share my voice, my thoughts. This is my world. There are no rules. I make up the rules of what is allowed on this podcast and what isn't. I'm not in a Facebook group where I'm at the mercy of other people's rules. I'm not on a platform that I don't own. So I own all of these recordings. I can do anything I like with them. And I really like that sense of freedom. And I really like that platform where I'm thinking, yeah, I have something to say and I can say it. And we all have something to say. We all have expertise that other people would love to learn from. So if you're feeling like self-doubt is holding you back, please don't let it. You have something that people want to know. You have something to say. But if you're worried that it may not serve as a good business tool and that's what you want to use it for, that's worth paying attention to, because it's a lot of work. It's a commitment. For it to work, it's a commitment. So you have to make sure you're making a decision that's really right for you. Now, this is actually the second episode I've created about some lessons learned from podcasting. I can't remember the exact number. Sorry, I should have checked before I recorded. But if you scroll down a little for a while, you will find an episode that I created maybe in the early-ish days where I was just sharing some early lessons learned. And there are more in there. I've purposely made sure that I'm not overlapping with that. So if you want a few more, scroll down and have a look at my old episode. Thank you, as always, for staying with me till the bitter end, and you'll hear from me on Wednesday. Would you like to take this discussion further? Perhaps you have some questions or you'd like more ideas on tailoring your business. If so, book a free discovery call through the link in the show notes.